In case, for those of you who do not know me, I'm Dr. Peter Kelpiano. I'm the director of the Initiative for Public Choice and Market Process. The mission of the Initiative for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. We support this mission in a variety of ways here at College Charleston School of Business, through our speaker series today, faculty research, student research opportunities, book colloquium. Honor today to introduce our speaker. Virginia Postrel was the editor of Reason magazine from 1989 to 2000. She is the author of The Substance of Style and The Future and Its Enemies. She currently edits the blog at glamour.net, and she is a contributing editor to The Atlantic and formerly wrote the Culture and Commerce column. She's been an economic columnist for the New York Times business section. She publishes articles in cultural and economic topics on a regular basis in a variety of outlets, including the Wall Street Journal. Writing in Vanity Fair, Sam Tanhoff described Postrel as, quote, a master DJ who sequences the latest riffs of the hard sciences, the social sciences, business, and technology, to name only a few sources. She is currently writing a book on glamour, which is the subject of our talk today. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Virginia Postrel, who's going to speak to us about the role of glamour in political economy.
Thanks very much, Pete. As you mentioned, I'm writing a book on glamour, and I also wrote this much more political economics book published over 10 years ago called The Future and Its Enemies. And the origin of this talk today, and the fact that I'm going to talk about glamour in political economy, goes back to toward the end of last year. C-SPAN, unbeknownst to me, I rebroadcast this interview with me from 10 years earlier about my first book. And so all of a sudden I go in and I get my email in the morning, and I've got all these emails from people about this book, and it was kind of exciting. Well, one of the guys said, well, I hear you're writing a book on glamour. They said you're writing a book on glamour, and I was really disappointed because I liked your interview, and I thought you would write more serious nonfiction. Well, I'm here to tell you today that glamour is a good subject for serious nonfiction, and in fact, even for people who watch C-SPAN rather than Project Runway. So a deeper understanding of glamour can help us explain and answer a number of questions that come up in our political life, such as, why isn't Hillary Clinton president of the United States right now? Or, why I live in California, why did California voters, by referendum, approve spending nearly $45 billion on a very speculative high-speed rail project when the state is nearly bankrupt? Why is Ayn Rand the most popular libertarian writer, as opposed to, say, F.A. Hayek or Milton Friedman or somebody like that? And finally, why does President Obama have so many problems governing? So over the course of this talk, I will get to some suggestions for ways that we might understand these questions. Now, glamour is a word that you hear everywhere. It's used particularly to sell magazines, obviously to sell fashion. It is a word that sounds really good. Unmistakable glamour, easy glamour, timeless glamour. These are the ideas. You want glamour, we're going to tell you how to get it. Glamour is back. Glamour is returning. We often hear that glamour has disappeared, and is often associated with things that are pink, like Postrel dogs and juicy couture outfits. What is glamour, I want to ask, and does it have to be pink and sparkling? Well, it helps to go back to the origins of the word. A lot of people think glamour is so glamorous, it must be French. No, it is in fact an old Scottish word. And if some of you watch True Blood on HBO, you may have heard glamour used as a verb, that vampires glamour people. This is related to the original use of her. In the old Scots, a glamour or glamour was a literal magic spell. We often talk about the magic of glamour today, but this was like, really, I cast a glamour on you, and you think this toad is a prince, or usually had to say sense of something that looks better than it actually is. And so it was a literal magic spell. A writer named Sir Walter Scott popularized, he was Scottish originally. Scottish was actually a separate language. And he popularized it in English. And again, as the sense of a literal magic spell. So he would talk about people casting glamours. In 1721, so this is going back, there's a dictionary definition as of the early 18th century. When devils, wizards, or jugglers deceive the sight, they are said to cast glamour or the eyes of a spectator. So this idea of illusion is still there in the way we use glamour today. And over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, a lot of writers used the word glamour in a way that wasn't a literal magic spell, but also had nothing to do with like Hollywood or dresses or music or anything like that. Joseph Conrad talked about the glamour of youth. The glamour of youth is not the idea that it's glamorous to be young. The glamour of youth is what, when you're young, you think you can do everything. I mean, you think you can do anything. You don't think about danger. Similarly, the glamour of inexperience. In the book Jane Eyre, Jane calls this mansion splendid, and she's told, no, you have the glamour of inexperience. You don't recognize that there are cobwebs, and the staircase is falling apart, and this sort of thing. The glamour of battle was a very common term up through, and I'll come back to it later in the talk, up through the First World War. Confederates in particular like to talk about the glamour of battle. A number of different notions of glamour. Even today, Catholic liturgy asks the faithful to eschew the glamour of evil. In other words, don't be like Eve in the garden, looking at the forbidden fruit and thinking, oh, it's so enticing, and fall for something that's evil by thinking that it's good. So there's always this notion of delusion and seduction. By the early 20th century, you have a number of different sort of dictionary definitions. You still have this notion of a charm, a literal magic spell, but you also get these other kinds of ideas that kind of haze in the air, cause things to appear different from what they really are, and any artificial interest in or association with an object through which it appears delusively magnified or glorified. So glamour makes things look better than they are. It's a way that we disguise things. So I want to show you a very, very short clip from a famous at the time classic movie, black and white, with the most glamorous star in the 20s and 30s, Greta Garbo. This is from the movie Queen Christina, and what's happening in this scene is Queen Christina, played by Greta Garbo, Queen of Sweden, has gone out into the countryside disguised, not very convincingly to the audience, but in the movie, everyone falls for it, as a young man. And she's run into the Spanish ambassador to Sweden, who is played by John Gilbert, who was often her co-star. And they're having a discussion about the difference in courtship in Spain versus Sweden. So in Spain, the men sing poetry to the women, and there's very, they really woo them, but in Sweden, well, you'll see. She thinks that's all a bunch of
somewhat mechanical. Evidently, these values make too much fuss about it. Simple, evident of thing like love. We Swedes are more direct.
But that's civilization. Disguise the elemental and the glamorous.
So civilization is about disguising the elemental with the glamorous. We take what is fundamental to human nature, in this case, sex appeal, and we add a layer of something that's enticing and beautiful on top of it. In generally the same period, there was a very influential photographer who basically developed a style that came to be known as photography in Hollywood named George Morel. And he defined what he did as bring out the best, conceal the worst, and leave something to the imagination. Mystery is another very important element of glamour. So what I want to do is to give you kind of a definition of glamour that we can then apply. Glamour is an illusion that focuses and intensifies inchoate desire. That is, you have this kind of general wish that things would be different, maybe that you would be the center of attention, therefore glamorous. It's that sparkly things for a particular audience make certain associations, which then make you intensify your desire. Think about glamour as being sort of like humor. Humor takes a lot of different forms. It depends on having the right joke and the right audience, the interacting. But there's something called humor that we recognize across categories. You can sell anything with glamour, not just film and fashion. It's just those things are particularly well sold with glamour. And you can even sell political candidates, policies, ideas, and worldviews. So here we have two vintage outfits on I'm not going left and right. On your right, we have a gingham dress, which in the, say, 20s or 30s would have been the almost the equivalent of like blue jeans and a t-shirt for a housewife. And this is like what you would wear around the house, very practical, easy to care for, a gingham dress. And on the left, we have a pink neckerchief. Again, in that era, this is actually silk, very enticing, making you feel like a movie star. So one makes you feel like a housewife, and you see the other like a movie star. So you go to the store, and what happens? This is a quote from Lois Ardrey, who was an early advertising type. We all know the woman who went to buy a practical blue gingham dress and came home with an impractical pink silk neckerchief. We all are that woman now. Our known want and recognized need is for a blue gingham dress. But the sight of a pink silk negligee somehow sets aflame a desire which, until this unrestrained moment, we have not known existed. Dormant desires unknown even to ourselves, but how full of possibilities. And she called this inarticulate longings. And she was writing for other advertising people and saying, you know, what you need to think about in terms of the consumer is not just what they say they want, it's how to figure out what it is that they really want and show it to them somehow in what I would call a glamorous way, so that their desire, which they haven't articulated even to themselves, suddenly is made concrete, is focused. So this brings us back to Hillary Clinton. Now, if you had asked me in 2007, asked me or asked many people in 2007 or 2008, who will the next president of the United States be? I think most people who weren't rabid Republican partisans probably would say, well, the odds are Hillary Clinton. It looks like it's going to be a Democratic year. She's the inevitable Democratic nominee. She's established herself. Here she is. But comes along this guy. I mean, he'd given a good speech at the Democratic National Convention. He was a senator from Illinois. But he wasn't on, you know, if you'd asked somebody in 2004, say, you know, will Barack Obama be the next president of the United States? They would say, Barack, what's that? Oh, Barack Obama? You know, but suddenly he's the president. So why is this? Well, Hillary, unfortunately for her, it turned out to be a blue gingham dress. And now President Obama is the pink one, right? The negligee. People, when he became, it wasn't what people articulated, or let's say they even Democratic voters, it wasn't what they wrote down on paper that they would have wanted in a president, somebody experienced who had these certain views, who was a known factor, familiar, blah, blah, blah. There were other desires that were unarticulated, that people saw this person and they said, that's the guy. And when he was running, it was very interesting because this glamour, which included the fact that he wasn't, you know, Hillary Clinton, who everybody knew, it had this little element of mystery to it, also meant that people projected onto him whatever it was that they wanted. So you had people who said, well, I understand that Senator Obama says that he is against free trade, but the free trade agreement with NAFTA, he's against free trade, but you know, he is so smart. And he could not possibly really believe that. He's just lying to those those other voters. But he really agrees with me. And there was a lot of this, with whatever people liked themselves, they projected onto him. And in some cases, that turned out to be his policies, in some cases not. But that's a very good way to build 51% and win if you can have glamour. But we'll get back to him later a little bit. It's very rare in politics, however, because we live in an age of full disclosure, and glamour requires a certain element of mystery so that people can imagine things in the person can. So this was, of course, the iconic poster, which is itself was a very glamorous style, and his logo, which has the horizon, the road toward the horizon, is also very glamorous. The promise of change, of renewal, and even the way it's stylized. But again, this would not have worked if the candidate himself was not already glamorous to his audience. And so now we are sitting in our pink lingerie eating our lunch. So when we decode glamour, we can break different kinds of glamour into certain elements that appear again and again. One is the promise of escape and transformation, of a different, better life. You're a different person, you're in a different place, to be literal, or say in the case of the president, the country will be transformed, it will be changed in a way that people want. Another is the idea of grace. Things seem effortless, they seem easy, flaws are hidden, you see only the positive, not so, and this is a little tricky. When you glamorize something, you make it look better than, you hide the flaws. But if you hide too many of the flaws so that it looks unnatural, and you can think about people overdoing Photoshop or something, then it tips over. It has to be just right. Just enough that people can project themselves into whatever it is, while still not breaking the spell by thinking about, maybe that's a little too perfect. And similarly, one way to do that is through allowing some mystery. There is a backstage, in the case of a performance, there is something that's unknown about a person. They're not, putting their whole life on, on the internet. There's something that's different about them. They're not too familiar. So, escape and transformation. I want to put a bit long series of things that are associated with glamorous images. One of the things that we think about, one of the things we think about is being in a different place, glamour of travel, glamour of aviation. The aviator was a very common glamorous notion in the early 20th century. And in fact, between the world wars, one of the first uses of the word glamour, the way we understand it today, was to apply to male aviators. It's not a feminine characteristic. They call them glamour boys. And you can think about, actually, Leonardo DiCaprio has played two glamorous aviators in different ways in The Aviator and also in Catch Me If You Can. It's a good, the Conman being another kind of glamorous but dangerous archetype. Grace, something is hidden. There's a very famous Renaissance book called The Book of the Courtier, where the author is giving people instructions on how to be successful courtiers, sort of an ideal courtier type in those days. And he talks about sprezzatura, which is it's often kind of like nonchalance. We might say cool in a kind of way. It's you conceal all the art and make whatever it is done or said appear to be without it. So you practice your dance performance so much that when you actually get out on stage, it seems effortless. Or you're so good at conversation, you always have the right witty words to say, makes you very glamorous to people around you, because that is, we all know, actually quite difficult. Effortless glamour, as I found one ad, is a very common term. We see streamlining as a glamorous notion. There's often this the magical iPad. One thing that makes it magical and makes it a glamorous device is because of the interface. Fred Astaire and were a glamorous pair of dancers in classic Hollywood movies of the 30s and 40s. And there are a couple of things about them where their grace is really, in the movie, the way it generally works is he's courting her and all of a sudden they start dancing. Everything looks beautiful and graceful. Well, of course, they were perfectionists. They practiced and practiced and practiced, and this only comes through with hard work. But the audience doesn't see the hard work. And the other thing is, in between takes, they would have a crew that would come and clean out all the scratches from the floor, so that they look like they're dancing on air. Having that backstage, that part that an audience doesn't see, is very important to maintaining the effortless aspect of life. And then I mentioned mystery. Sunglasses are the classic glamorous accessory. A lot of glamorous photography uses shadow, silhouettes very effectively, skylines, the city sidewalk right by the store, say. It's usually not very glamorous, but from a distance you see all that possibility. What's behind those windows? Everyone is a life that you perhaps could give that would be more interesting, more exciting, better than the one that you have today. As I talked about, glamorize is a form of deception. We talk a lot, I'm sure many of you are familiar with people talking about too much use of Photoshop to make models look perfect. This is actually one of Pharrell's photos from the 1930s. I don't know how well you can see, but this is an actress named Joan Crawford that you lots of thinking of. And this is the before, and she is completely covered in freckles. And she also has these little lines. And this was done in a dark room with a pencil. And not only does he get rid of all the freckles and the lines, but also he makes the highlights, makes the shadows more interesting. This is glamour photography. Not only removing the flaws, but also creating a sense of mystery. One of my favorite examples of the way these glamorized rooms is, what's wrong with this picture? Well, here's a hint. If you look at a Crate and Barrel catalog, you almost never see a lamport. Even when you can see, it shows up better on my screen than you hear it. You can see all the area where the lamport would have to be. But somehow in this glamorous world of the perfect interior, nobody needs lamps because everything is just gracefully moving free. And we all know this is what the real one is. This is actually underneath Jeff Bezos' desk. I mentioned earlier a very common 19th century, early 20th century term, glamour of fashion. And I mentioned this for two reasons. One is that I think it's very important to understand that glamour is not a feminine concept. And in fact, even the way it's been traditionally used, anything that you aspire to can potentially be glamorous. And soldiers from ancient Greece to present day have been glamorous archetypes. However, in the glamour of battle, it lost a lot of its resonance after the First World War, because in the European nations in particular went into the First World War all enamored with the glamour of battle and the heroism and the this and the that, and it turned out to be, war may be necessary, may be unavoidable sometimes, but it is not graceful, it is not pleasant, it is full of suffering and death and just like grunge. So it kind of lost a lot of its glamour. So glamour in politics. We find glamour in different areas of politics. And talking about President Obama, a little bit about people. Obviously, a famous, another famous glamorous figure would be John F. Kennedy. It's not just that they're young and good looking, although that often sort of creates a sense of glamour. People want to identify with them. But they also have to have some things associated with some ideas, often ideas of the future, ideas of progress. Policies can be very glamorous. And in fact, if you're trying to sell a policy, what you want to do is not sell all the nitty-gritty of every little detail, but in fact, a vision of how this could transform your life and and you want to hide as much as possible of the sort of flaws and downside. And the same is true of worldviews and concepts. So I've become very interested in a very common motif. When I was a kid in the 60s and before I was born in the 50s, there was a very common iconic thing was rockets. There were rockets and also atoms on it. And they represented the future. They were very glamorous in their in conjuring up an idea of a freer, more interesting, more exciting, and graceful future. Well, today, wherever you go, wherever you see women. Similarly, they're portrayed as very glamorous, very graceful. They are beautiful in these pictures. They turn with apparently effortlessly, and they're used to advertise all kinds of things, from cars to MBA programs, even preschools, daycare centers, sketch pads, and you'll appreciate this. Even your Penelope Becky's book, The Economic Way of Thinking, now has glamorous windmills on the cover. Something about you, and it's very important because this is a still. Here are the windmills. There was an article yesterday, I believe, in the New York Times about people getting very upset that they were now living in the wild North Dakota or whatever with all these windmills, and they moved, or Maine, I think it was, they moved there for the quiet, and now it wasn't quiet anymore. Again, if you're running for something, you want to show that you are a candidate of the future. I've sort of lost which is which, but one of these is a McCain ad, one of these is an Obama ad, and one of these is an ad for T. Boone Pickens' initiative to subsidize his windmill farm. It's not just windmills. I mentioned when I was setting up the questions that there's, like state of California, voters voted for this high-speed rail to go between northern and southern California. And they voted for it partly because of this notion that high-speed rail is zooming us to the future. This is from Shanghai, where there's, and I went to Shanghai to research glamour, and I thought it might go on this maglev. The problem is it goes from the airport to nowhere. It's like this little tiny train. I mean, it is very short, and so once you're there, then you have to get on like a traditional subway to get anywhere. But it's a rider road. It's not about getting from point A to point B. It's a glorious glide from the past to the future. And in California, they marketed this initiative with pictures like this. Wouldn't you want to zoom along in this train and look, see them? And the notion is somehow if you had these trains, you wouldn't be in a line with the baggage of the airport security taking off your shoes. Of course, the problem is that if you had the train and everybody rode the train, then the train would become a target for terrorism, and the next thing you knew, you would have security theater at the train stations too. And that's even leaving aside the questions of ridership and some practical policy issues. We have glamorous, there are many powerful glamorous ideas that inform our politics and culture or other people's politics. The green economy is a notion, it's very general, it's very, the details are often omitted, there's a kind of mystery because we don't have it, so we must be better. It represents a transformation into something where people imagine it will be better than today, not only in terms of providing jobs or whatever, but even in terms of sort of creating energy in some way that seems effortless. The American dream. The American dream is very glamorous, a very inspiring concept. The fact that glamour can have a delusive or illusionary aspect of it does not mean it can't be powerful and inspiring and positive. On the other hand, New Soviet Man, which was the notion that the communist government of the Soviet Union would sort of remake human nature, was inspiring to some people, and they killed millions of people in a way of creating this glamorous vision. Free enterprise. Again, something about that. Say, it's very glamorous. What do you mean, free enterprise? I mean, words put together in a way that encourages people to project into it what their vision of positive business is. And one of my favorites is just change the world. You can change the world. And that is a very glamorous concept. Change the world from what to what? What's going to be involved? Where are the details? What exactly is going on? One of the most glamorous ideas in politics is the notion of top-down planning. Wise people making decisions to shape cities, to shape economies, whatever it might be. And I was very interested to discover that Paul Krugman, the economist and New York Times columnist, great inspiration was this series of books written by Asimov that in which there was this character called Harry Seldon who was able to scientifically do some of the right mathematical equations, know exactly what society would look like in the future, and therefore to alter that path. And there's a notion here that if somebody if you're very smart enough, you can gather all the necessary information in and really make the world better through systematic planning. And I will be another speech to go through the problems with that. But let me just show you another glamorous example of this, which was at the 1939 World's Fair. There was this incredibly memorable, wonderful exhibit called the Futurama. And people would go and it would show you, what the city of the future would be. You would be like over it, kind of hovering around and driving around in it. Lots of people who went to that World's Fair, they still remember it to this day. And E.L. Doctorow, who's one of those people when as a child, wrote a novel about somebody, and he writes about, no matter what I heard about the Futurama, nothing compared with seeing it for myself. All the small moving parts, all the lights and shadows, the animations, as if I were looking at the largest, most complicated toy ever made. It was a toy that any child in the world would want to own. You could play with it forever. This was a wonderful, wonderful World's Fair, think of it as like a theme park kind of ride. The problem is when you start to translate that vision into politics, what it does is it turns people's lives into toys for somebody to play with. And so between 1939 and say the mid-60s, people started to get less enamored of this vision and to sort of push back and say, oh, wait a minute, it looks great when it's a ride, but I don't want some distant authority deciding to tear down my neighborhood and build a different one, or I don't want some distant authority regulating my business and telling me exactly what I have to do. There was a pushback, and it came both from the left and the right, because this notion, which has seemed very glamorous in the early 20th century, of orderly, rational planning of society, people started to realize, as it became more and more real in politics, people started to realize the negative aspects of it and the ways that it intruded on their own private plans. However, there was a reason that this type of thought, and Che Guevara is the glamorous figure on everyone's t-shirt, and everyone can kill a lot of people. But Adler, whom I mentioned earlier, is not as popular as Ayn Rand, more intellectual, noted that socialist thought owes its appeal to the young. He's writing in the 40s, which was quite a thing among young people, largely to its visionary character. The very courage to indulge in utopian thought is in this respect a source of strength to the socialists, which traditional liberalism, by which I meant liberalism in European form, which includes free markets, sadly lacks. And the notion was, if you want to persuade people to your political point of view, and you're excited as he was and believe in free markets and freedom of individuals to order their own lives, you can't just be a naysayer. You can't just be saying what's wrong with socialism, what's wrong with this, what's wrong with that. People, particularly young people, want something inspirational. They want a glamorous vision of a worldview. And this, I think, is why Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand are more popular when more people read her. Partly I found it on the internet. It's somebody's rendition of what it looks like. And we're all these smart, talented, entrepreneurial people gather it together in this valley in Colorado and create their own free new society. And I have to say, in my years of editing these magazines, I kept finding libertarians who were determined to go off someplace and create their own little golf course. Well, this is great in a novel. It's very persuasive. It's emotionally resonant. It creates that focused desire, and it can inform your political views. But in real life, this would not work because we need a greater diversity of people in society. You need more trade than they have. There are lots of things about it that wouldn't work, and it's sort of desiccated. So one way when people engage in political discourse and you're up against somebody who seems very glamorous or an idea that seems very glamorous, seems very persuasive, and you're like, this is wrong, wait a minute, what is it, why are you going for this high-speed rail? I can show you would have to have twice as many passengers as the bullet trains in Japan, and it would go from nowhere to nowhere, and there are all these problems with it, and nobody's listening because it's so pretty. You have to think about, well, how do I break this about? How do I puncture the glamour? There are a number of ways that glamour disappears, whether we're talking about politics or movie stars or whatever. One is active debunking. I show you the problems with it. You see the problems, you see the flaws, and you decide that's not for me. And sometimes what happens, and you definitely see this with Obama and Sliders campaign, is people who don't like whatever the object is, in this case the candidate, instead of saying, well, can't be everything to all people, and he's got this flaw and that flaw, they flip it on its side. And instead of being ideal, it becomes horrible. It becomes extreme. The opposite of glamour is horror. What's being hidden, it's not just that we don't know everything, it must be something really bad. So debunking can take just a pragmatic point of view, or it can take a horror view. Another way that glamour disappears is things just get too familiar. You have experience, and your dream job turns out to be just a job. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't regret taking it, but it's no longer this transformation of your life. Or you buy the perfect dress, the pink negligee, the little, and you like it, you feel good in it, but you're still the same person, and your life is still the same. It's too much familiar. And then the final way to conquer glamour is through humor and ridicule, satire, showing what's ridiculous about the ideas. So this is an ad from PETA trying to get people not to wear fur coats. Here's the rest of your fur coat. Right? You do the horror thing, show the skin fox. Mentioned travel glamour. I did an interview with Manolo, the shoe blogger. I don't know if any of you read that blog, but and I asked him, what is Venice glamorous, or Paris or Venice, which is glamorous? And he said, well, Venice is glamorous until the breeze off the Adriatic brings you the smell of rotting fish and raw sewage, at which point it is like Hoboken with better architecture. So too much knowledge, too much information. We have this phrase, too much information. That's a good way to get rid of glamour. And it's one reason glamour is hard to maintain these days. Again, familiarity breeds disillusion. Like I said at the beginning, when Barack Obama was running for president, people who disagreed with each other, and in some cases disagreed with his stated official position, projected onto him that he agreed with them because he seemed like such a fantastic guy. So smart, so handsome, so slightly exotic, mysterious, etc. So he must agree. Well, now he's actually president, and he actually has to make decisions, and he actually has to choose this policy rather than that policy, and disillusionment has set in. And since it's a change over time, this can't just be Republicans who hated him from the get-go. It's disillusionment. And I think that he's now experiencing, as being in office, the downside of glamour, which is that people projected themselves onto you. You were not actually yourself in their mind, you were them. And when they find out that you don't agree with them in every respect, they're disappointed. Or alternatively, even worse than projecting themselves on you, they projected their ideal world onto you and somehow thought that you would be magic and you would create this ideal world and nobody knew it. So finally,
Tell you what I'll do.
I'm going to end with a little humor. I talked about high-speed rail glamour. Well, there's this famous clip, and I tried to get a better quality, but it turns out it's very hard to buy season 4 of The Simpsons in a hurry. So this is just a little clip. But I don't know how many of you have seen the classic episode Marge versus the Monorail. But monorails, particularly in the mid-20th century, were like spaceships. They were the future. They were glamorous. And it's like this high-speed rail today. And so here we see the Conman, essentially, trying to get the folks of Springfield to build the monorail.
I tell you what I'll do. I'll show you my idea. I give you the Springfield monorail. I've sold monorails to Broadway, Ogdenville, and North Haverbrook, and by God, they put them on the map. Well, sir, there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified 6-car monorail. When I say monorail, what's it called? Monorail. That's right, monorail.
I hear those things are awfully loud.
It flies as softly as a cloud. Instead of jets that fly through bed. Not on your life, my Hindu friend. What about the spring and sloth? You'll be given cushy job. Are you sick here finding the demos? No, good sir, I'm on the level.
The weight came off my playing can.
Take my penknife, Margaret. Spirits, throw up your hands and raise your voice. Once again.
The Matrix door cracked open. I'm on the
So instead of using their windfall, the town has gotten to fix the streets or make the schools better, they go for the glamorous project, and hilarity ensues. Anyway, I want to stop on that note with one thing to remember in the context of political economy. You spend a lot of time talking about public choice and interest groups and people behaving according to responsive incentives of what's good for them, particularly good for them financially. And all of that is true, and I'm not here to contradict that in any way, except to say that aspiration and identity and the glamour that feeds them can be as influential in shaping political decisions as interest. And in fact, the two often work in tandem. So that if you can inspire people to build your monorail because it taps into their inarticulate longings to be a big town that represents the future, then if you happen to be a monorail contractor, you can get the deal, and so everything works together. Thank you.
We do have time for questions. If anyone has any, we'll take questions.
How did you come up with the idea of glamour? Why?
Okay, well, yeah, why? Well, okay, what happened is I wrote this book called Substance of Style. And the Substance of Style is not at all. It's about bringing aesthetic value, improving the look and feel of goods and services, environments, into areas that were not traditionally aesthetic. So there's a famous paragraph about toilet brushes. So it's very not famous. But there was an exhibit at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art around the theme of glamour in architecture, industrial design, and automobiles and fashion. And the curator there asked me to write an essay on it. And I got very interested. I had always thought of myself as a person who is not interested in, how business logistics helps, improve the economy or make choice available to people. But it turned out that the persuasive power of glamour was very intriguing.
Well, I was just going to say that the last president that had a similar dive in their approval rating was Ronald Reagan going into 82. And when you look back at the 80 campaign, there's a lot of glamour also that was projected onto Reagan and promised a lot of changes as well. And, fantastical things like Star Wars.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think
do
Reagan
you
was
see
also.
parallels there?
Yeah, I think Reagan was also a glamorous president, and of course the other parallel, which has nothing to do with glamour, it's just the economy was really bad
Right.
in both cases. So it's not. But Reagan was also a glamorous president, and in fact, so difficult to know that he had this official biographer who followed him around for years, and then was incapable of writing a biography and ended up writing this fictional thing. What is different between the two is Reagan made certain political principles or ideological commitments clear. So that, there was a lot, as there always is with a politician, there was some mystery surrounding particular things. And of course, you're right about Star Wars being a glamorous idea, which he believed in, but there are lots of details it's difficult to execute. But the difference between Reagan and Obama's glamour, I think, is that because Reagan had been around, had been on the scene for so long, given so many rubber chicken speeches, and was so associated with certain key conservative ideas, people had a better sense of what they were
But
getting.
then again, he also hid the horror in that he did reduce government. Taxes did go up and down. I mean, you're right, he articulated his principles very clearly, and he personally stuck with them. But when you look at the operations of what happened in
Right, well,
government.
you never get the glamorous business. And the other person, the thing I thought you were going to say, which is like a section I cut out, and it has to do with Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was not glamorous. He was charismatic, which is something that people often associate. But a charismatic charisma, unlike glamour, is in the person. It's not in the audience. The audience, and it inspires loyalty to the person. And if that person dies, it dies with the person. And so with Clinton, people were loyal to him, and it was less about their ideal vision of the world. It was more about this person. And so that allowed him to weather certain storms. Well, I would say that I was stressing the importance of it. It's because it's always illusory. There's always an element of illusion to it. It's very easy to focus on the negative aspects, and in the political arena, it can be destructive because people adopt policies on the basis of this general vision, and then they don't pay attention to how it's implemented. But I do not think it is entirely destructive. I think that its inspirational aspects can be very important to the health and life not only of individuals but also of society. So, I mean, in a way, let's take something like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. When people talk about dreams, there is often an element of glamour that, and we would never completely realize that dream, but it created this sort of vision that is very inspiring, and despite maybe all the nitty-gritty isn't something you're going to get, is worth working toward. And I think that can also be the case with other political glamour. But I think at the policy level, when it becomes like this long, I think it's the political practice that can be more destructive, because you are not going to be able to just avoid the details.
Yeah. What factors do you think influence what's glamorous as it particular age or era. I know the cities don't seem to be very glamorous anymore. The image of the windmill-filled rural area versus the Dresden-filled.
Well, a lot of it's in the audience, you know. People tend to, because glamour is about sort of longing, it's something that is not familiar and that you don't have. And in fact, I showed briefly just one of these things that went by, but I have these two slides that they both are selling real estate. They both are selling high-rise condos. They both show a young, attractive person sitting on the windshield, one on the windowsill, looking at the skyline. The one I showed here was a young woman with another pretty young man. They're both very sort of off-the-shelf glamour. They have certain elements that make for glamour. It turns out that they're selling completely different things. The one is in the context of Dallas, and it's selling the vibrant city life, get away from the suburbs. And the other is for a complex in New York, and it's selling tranquility. And you look out on the water, and you go on their website, and the contrast there where they are to big garbage cans and waking you up. So that people sort of want what they don't have. And then there's also just personalities. What appeals to one person doesn't appeal to others. But you definitely see this transition where glamour exists over time, but the way it manifests itself differs. So, you know, you go from the Rat Pack glamour of the 1950s to rock star youth culture glamour in the 60s. And all of that's very different from the ideas of the 30s. And again, different audiences glamorize different things.
According to your lecture, one might say that perhaps Obama's healthcare bill owes part of its success to glamour in that it created a universal altruistic vision. But as you said about avoiding the details of policies, do you think that perhaps this glamour spell might be broken once people stop avoiding details? Or
Yeah, well, I think the idea of universal health care is a very glamorous idea. And in fact, one of the things that you saw, if you paid very close attention to that debate, is that there were two sort of contradictory ideas banging up against each other among people who supported some kind of behavior change. One was the goal is to get health care to everyone, and the other was the goal is to control costs. And those are really different things, because if you get health care to everyone, you're going to spend more money, because the whole idea is there's certain people, or I should say health insurance, but that's another thing that's outlived that's sort of pushed together. It's the difference between health insurance and health care, but still, there was this notion that if you would get universal health care, and even within the Democratic coalition, that meant very different things to different people. And I think as the actual thing that was passed gets implemented, and I think this is partly what those poll numbers are about, very little has been implemented, but people are, well, wait a minute, you know, I like the idea of health care reform, but this wasn't what I wanted. And people start to see the specifics of it and don't like it.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for attending.
In your opinion, do you still think you need persuasive glamour to bottom-up planning to work?
It's an interesting question. You know, it would be nice to have us, you know, to be able to create, there is a kind of glamour to the idea of complexity today. Complexity, it was really big 10 years ago. Complexity theory, fractals, a certain biological vision as opposed to a streamlined or physics or civil engineering vision that dominated the 20th century. And I think that has enabled the idea of bottom-up processes to become, in some minds, more glamorous or at least more cool. But it's difficult because when you're emphasizing unpredictability and surprise and things being out of control things get complicated, it's harder to get that particular vision, that particular line. It would be good though. I mean, glamour is a persuasive form of rhetoric, and if I want to persuade people that bottom-up processes are better, some glamour would be nice. Yeah. Well, if all goes well, yeah, I know, that's one of my editors. If all goes well, it will be out in 2012, so it's due almost exactly a year from now. So that's going on. Also, I should mention that I just started writing a column for the Wall Street Journal Saturday edition. They have this new section. They have two new sections. One is called Review, and it's not just because I write it. I think it's really an interesting section about ideas and books, and written in that Wall Street Journal very accessible style. And I'm writing a column every other week in there. So not necessarily that way, but about it's called Comics and Culture.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming. Again, you have the questionnaires. If you wouldn't take a few minutes to fill those out and drop them off on your way back, and if you will, one more time, we'd show your appreciation for the process.